Welcome to CropCast, a series of monthly arable podcasts bringing you the latest information, timely updates and expert advice. In today's episode,
we've worked on elicitor products that we know we can, laminarum, for example, in wheat is an example that has come to market, where we know you can substitute it for a T-naught spray, so you can use it to reduce your fungicide inputs, and we understand what it's doing. But I think there's a lot to sort there. We're much more conscious of resistance. We try and build it in. We know that some of our new fungicides, for example, are quite high risk products. So things like the QIIs have already been classed as high risk. We only use them once in a season. We use them in mixture. We're still trying to work in a multi-site. So I think we've learned a huge amount, but resistance risks are still with us.
I'm George Chalmers, and we've reached that time of the year when we can be a wee bit more reflective, a bit more nostalgic, and look back at how things used to be, the good or the bad old days. With that in mind, we're going to be talking to someone who has been the cutting edge of many of the changes in crop protection and crop production over the past few decades. She's one of the few people who can tell you the difference between an azole and an azoxystrobulin, right down to molecular level. Agronomy meetings would not be complete without her disease response curves and her messages on the importance of pesticide resistance strategies. So today I am joined by Professor Fiona Burnett, aka the Crop Doctor. Fiona, how are you?
I'm very well, George. That was a nice introduction.
Thanks. Can you give us just a bit of an insight into your background, how you ended up working in crop pathology and protection, and what bits do you love about it?
Oh my goodness, that's a lot in one question. I had no direct connection with farming when I started back in it was the late 1980s, and I came to what was then SAC Aberdeen to work on powdery scab of potatoes, which was a new disease at the time. And I just fell in love with that. The community, the farming community, the interest. It was incredible, and it was a busy department. They were running a crop clinic. There were people coming and going all the time, and I just thought it was a huge amount of luck. I fell into the thing that I loved, and food and how it's produced has just continued to be more and more important since. And then the pathology, the disease piece is, again, it was always a big part of what kept Scottish crops yielding well or not. And pesticides and then laterally IPM became a feature of what I was working on with others. And that sort of switch from a heavy reliance on pesticides and intensive production through to kind of smarter ways of working just kept it really interesting all along. And great people, it's been a great community to work in.
Yeah. Farmers and agronomists are well aware of your industry-facing work, but your career has been much, much more broader than that.
I would like to think so. I'm sure my mother would like to think so. The kind of the research that really had those applied outputs and working kind of in food assurance and working along supply chains, thinking about I've enjoyed working with social scientists, for example, so thinking about why people take risks, what risks they're up for, how the public feels about their food, how farmers feel about, their production methods. So that kind of connectivity where we can sort of look across fences and think along supply chains has just been something that felt important and really interested me.
When you started, it must have been a really exciting time to have been involved, just right close to the coalface. Farmers were looking at other crops. Winter cropping had become much more popular, certainly in Scotland. Oilseed rape was really probably still in its infancy. And farmers were even looking at other crops that you don't see nowadays. There's like linseed, pulses. It must have been a real buzz about it at that time.
There was, George. You've really put your finger on it. We were still on that, crop yields, arable cropping in Scotland had increased massively sort of from the 1970s to the 1990s. And you're right, things like oilseed rape, that was a novel crop then. And I remember working on that. It was twice the height it is now, way over your head. And again, and it was this magic new low input crop. And the winter cropping was interesting too. So there were some people set dead against winter cropping because of that green bridge, and they said we should never do this in Scotland. And actually, look where we are now, where it's a really successful part of our crop production system. Um, People were growing, they were well rewarded. We were in a period of inflation, but generally, farm outputs were massively up. Um, and systemic chemistry was kind of a silver bullet. We could really push yields, and we've learned a lot since. So I think again that's interesting. The kind of then until now, that some things like linseed pulses are of course coming back into our rotations. So we've seen that kind of move towards more integrated systems. So nothing new under the sun, but you know I feel there's an element of coming full circle.
Yeah. I'm thinking back when I was young, and my dad and his boss and people like that, it was yield that was king. I mean, that was the driver. Um, there's no doubt, and I'm speaking to the next generation now. Attitudes are totally different nowadays. Yeah, yield's still very important, but someone leaving college to farm today enters a very, very different arable industry from that of a generation ago. Um, when and why do you think things changed?
I think there was always, even back in the 1990s, there was people were beginning to worry a bit about soil degradation, environmental impacts. Some of the things we were using were frankly not nice for the environment or for us. I was busy dusting potatoes with fungicide. Nobody would want to go back to that sort of practice. Um, but that feeling that there was a kind of one size fits all, we could really push yield. And now we're moving on to kind of smarter ways of really tailoring what we're doing. And of course, we're bringing new technologies to that. But we lost a lot of pesticides along the way. Things like resistance have kind of forced our hands. So the kind of some people are moving to more regenerative practice from the point of view of they simply have to. And then others, I think, are much more open to bringing on board those sustainable production methods. We know it's what large bits of the supply chain want from us. So I think an element of push and pull. And I also think there's a nice piece here that I think back in the day, there was maybe a much more binary approach. You were either organic or you were very conventional. And I think the way people are beginning to think in that regenerative middle ground is just a really constructive way to go.
I think there is a greater awareness. I think you're right there that there is a greater awareness. I mean, I see it up here that in the past, even autumn sown cover crops and things like that, the cost, or is it worth it? It's not worth it. That would have been, folk would have said, no, 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 I'm not doing it. Now, they can see a bit of value in it. Just this living route through the winter. And certainly now folk are, even using it to grow a crop that you can graze off. There is more interest in a lot of these practices, no doubt about that.
That's right. And I see sort of IPM, integrated pest management, nested within that whole regenerative package. And again, we've seen practices that perhaps were always there at a low level, but it's a much more formalized system now that people are much more interested in practicing. And I think, that's a large part of, the forward direction.
Mm. You touched on it just a couple of minutes ago. We have seen so many actives go over time. I mean, I've got a book in here, a chemical catalogue from 1984, and there's just nothing left, put it like that. And there seems to be less and less coming forward. I remember a number of years ago, chlorothalonil, it went, and there was fears of rampant ramularia and side-to-side septoria, but it hasn't really happened, or perhaps not as bad as we feared. Are we guilty of being just a wee bit too prophylactic at times, or do you think it's still good practice to use multi-sites?
I do, and we could get on to why, where I think with the best multi-sites can still be part of a programme. We have lost a lot of those actives that you're referencing for resistance reasons. So I think diversity in a spray programme is a good thing. But I think some of what we've lost for legislative and safety reasons or environmental concerns have been lost for good reasons. So, I remember a time, we had MBCs, we had, um, multi-sites like Maneb and things, which, um, yeah, we've moved on. But I think we've been very lucky that we've been in a very innovative industry. So we've actually had quite a lot of new fungicides recently, in completely new groups. So that's a positive thing. But we're much more aware about how we have to steward them and look after them. So we've come a long way. And again, back in the day, I mean, I remember when there was lots of continuous barley, but the answer in terms of spraying was almost always tilt corbel, was a mix that you'll remember, George. And we've come a long way from that one size fits all sort of approach to much more tailored, much more risk based ways of dealing with things. Yeah, so that was a long answer to do I think multi sites are still part of the mix, but I do, but in the right context.
Yeah, yeah. Um, in terms of chemicals, do you think there's been an active or a group of chemicals that you've seen coming down the tracks and you've thought this is going to be the next big thing, but just didn't take off, or just never really got the launch it should have, or just didn't quite make it?
Uh, yes and no. So things like I remember the excitement when the strobilurins were going through testing. So that's been one of the nice aspects of working on new fungicides before launch. There's a few things that you see you think, wow. Um, and I think obviously the strobilurins, we're still using them, so there's a positive, but just in, we use quite a bit in barley and against rust, say, but they failed within a couple of seasons against a major disease like septoria. But again, at the time, they were so good that I remember people saying, oh, you need to mix with a strobilurin as another strobilurin. And of course, now we know that a reliance on a single group is a surefire way to break it. Um, I have seen things coming through, for example, as seed treatments, which got pulled for um, probably quite valid environmental reasons, and also for resistance reasons. There was a series of seed treatments which actually might have conflicted with your foliar sprays. So there are a few examples where there's a lot of investment made, and often they get pulled quite early, but occasionally they get almost all the way to market and vanish.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there must have been actives that have maybe reached market, but maybe have just lost approval. Uh, Not necessarily through any risks, or residue fears, but just maybe not put up for renewal again, that have fallen by the wayside. Perhaps a missed opportunity. Have you seen if that happen?
Yeah, I mean, there have been examples. I'm struggling to immediately pull one to the front of my mind, but the kind of feeling that actually agrochemicals are very expensive to develop and to maintain. And once they go off patent, it's hard for somebody to justify kind of keeping the approvals going. And barley's it's a major crop to us, but actually on the scale of growing rice or bananas, it's probably relatively low investment. Um, so yeah, probably the Mancaseb story, which has kind of moved around, and I think is now being supported by a manufacturer, but that might be an example where it came or is perilously close to going, uh, and there is a faint fond hope it might come back. I don't know how realistic that is.
Yeah, you mentioned there that the barley, to us, barley is the crop. Um, but I think we're seeing this year, especially, winter 2025, folk are scratching their heads, looking at other options. So I'm certainly getting people speaking about growing oats next year, and the pesticides option for oats is even less than barley. And there's a lot, you're struggling looking for emus and such like. It's can be very challenging.
Yes. Yeah, and the same for a crop like rye, which again was a fairly novel crop a few years ago. Um, and we're on a fairly limited palette in terms of managing rye. Um, but yeah, oats and rye do relatively well, often in Scottish conditions, and were often regarded as fairly low disease risk crops. And again, because they're being more widely grown, the disease pressures are building up a bit. And we're on that limited palette of chemistry, which is a concern.
Pesticides and agrochemicals, clearly they've been really important for decades, and they go to obviously for in terms of crop protection. Um, can you see any new technologies and actives coming through?
New technology, I think that's just a hugely exciting area. And you could take that all the way from kind of precision application, cameras and sensors in fields, right through to kind of better use of our data to help us make decisions. So again, I kind of referred to that, an agronomic approach that is kind of one size fits all, right through to I think where we are now, using technology to tailor the decisions, look for the risks. So people are using all sorts of clever weather apps. That's obviously a major aspect to what drives risk in a crop. We can I think the blight is a good example
Hmm.
where people know the genotypes that are prevalent in a season. You can tailor inputs. You can look at the weather related risks. You've got technologies recognizing weeds in fields now, and that was pie in the sky stuff even 5 years ago. And now there are working examples where if you can just treat the bits of a field that need it, you could be using a tenth, a hundredth of the amount of pesticide. And that's a win-win. You're managing the crop risk, you're saving money, and you're treading a bit more lightly on the environment.
Yeah, yeah. Um, a similar line. We're seeing more and more, perhaps of a market now for or more products coming into marketplace that would be classed as perhaps biostimulants, and also the role of crop nutrition. What's your thoughts on that?
So it's a really complex field, George, and a contentious one. So at one end of that spectrum, you have really useful biostimulants and elicitors, and people know how they're working. They're switching on an immune response in the plants, and you have some really useful biostimulants as well, or crop nutrition pieces. Unfortunately, the legislation and the registration process is quite complex. So often there's a kind of blurry area where there are label claims for activity, or just kind of suggestions that hint at and that are essentially marketing. And unfortunately, that kind of spectrum maybe discredits the whole field, and it's unfair to the examples that are actually really effective. So we've worked on elicitor products that we know we can, laminarum, for example, in wheat is an example that has come to market, where we know you can substitute it for a T-naught spray, so you can use it to reduce your fungicide inputs, and we understand what it's doing. Um, but I think there's a lot to sort there. And there's also a hurdle at the moment where um, things like biopesticides have to demonstrate an almost equivalent level of control um, to a conventional piece of chemistry. And that is to take out of the system quite a lot of quite useful products that even if they only bring 50% control, that is still useful in a diverse programme. And I know that the Chemical Regulations Directorate are looking at that very carefully at the moment, that we could bring in more of these products and be a bit more transparent about what we do, or what they claim, and then do away with some of that snake oil type claiming that I think doesn't do any credit to the rest of the market.
Now, IPM has been a large part of your work, certainly maybe more recently. Now, IPM plans, I fill them out for clients. I think my advice to people is that, yeah, you want to have as good a score as possible, but really it's important that you perhaps be a little bit better next time you're working to that. Um, do you think the messages are getting across there? It's not just a tick box exercise, or do you think there's still more work to be done by farmers and the industry in general?
Yeah, I mean, the genuine uptick in what people are doing is encouraging, and Scottish farmers actually across the piece score quite well, which is good. But I'm really glad you raised that point about the IPM score, because that IPM plan that Scottish growers are filling in was developed by farmers. So, what their perceptions were of the value of, say, varietal resistance or rotation and reducing their risk. So it's kind of industry generated. And the point is not to generate a high score. The point is to score yourself. Nobody looks, you keep a record. And then you try and improve, as you've said. So you begin to, and again, we're seeing people pick up, for example, more legumes in a rotation, extending their rotations. In grass, they're thinking a bit more carefully about their weeds and things. Um, so that kind of just slow improvement in what they're doing is I think a really positive aspect of that integrated way of thinking. Um, and like I say, I see IPM nesting within that whole regen set of practices.
Yeah, I think that's an important message as well. That um, yeah, it's been part of farm assurance for a long, long time, but more and more people are having to do them now as for whole farm plan. Um, it's not a pass or a fail. It's you're getting a score, and it's yeah, working to improve it over time. I think that's a fair
Yeah.
way to look at it.
And when you complete one of these plans, it sends you suggestions that you could think about. So you get a little bit of feedback. And yeah, you keep a copy of that year's IPM plan as part of your assurance scheme so that, you're transparent that you've thought about it. Um, but again, it's for me, there are so many elements in IPM that are win wins, so that you're thinking about your variety, you're thinking about a rotation, um, things that genuinely reduce your risk of pest, weeds, and diseases up front. And then, of course, you're working on your chemistry, you're thinking about what you're using, you're thinking about things like fungicide resistance, and you're working in a kind of sustainable way. But there's a lot in that that's just about managing your risk. Um, and who wouldn't want to do that?
No, no, that's right. And speaking of risks, I think the last few decades, there's become a much greater awareness of the risk to environment, to operators, and food residues as well of what pesticides can leave. Um, you must have noticed a huge difference in regulation in that time.
Yes, and I think we generally sort of talk about regulation and think, oh, it's there to steal our toys, and it's not. I mean, like I said earlier, I think you can look back at chemicals that we had, and actually nobody misses them. They weren't safe on the environment, and they weren't great for us. Um, for example, I used to be dusting potatoes with fungicides, with a what by today's standards would be a fairly feeble mask. So there's been so much that's happened, that's really moved things forward. But again, the crop safety aspects, there was a lot in that was also about mycotoxins, which are still an issue today. But I mean, we had a lot of open storage, and you think how sophisticated crop storage, grain storage is now, and how secure it is against vermin, birds, rain. So it's not just about the crop safety aspects that come from pesticides. It's, that whole wider piece about our practice.
Yeah, and I think even if you look at operators, the way I mean, it's probably not that long ago that you wearing gloves was maybe regarded as maybe the wimpy thing to do. Why are you wearing gloves? Tractors had cabs, but probably didn't have air conditioning. Hot day, windows open, the spray drifters would be treated as a nice refreshing mist. It was that bad, and you might laugh about it now, but it's that kind of things that were happening. There's such a difference in approach with that. It's professional operators we've got now.
Absolutely. And that comes a lot from training. No, I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but I remember the smell of Mistral in the air. You kind of pride yourself in being able to recognize the smell of a spray going on. And that's horrific now.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, the mindset, I often think it's a bit like the move from drink driving, which became socially unacceptable. The move to just going, it does nobody any favors to be, you know, behaving in a way that is now recognized as very poor practice. So yeah, huge improvements. And of course, the kind of move to, you know, controls like proper cabs and things has been another game changer in terms of the safety of what we're doing. And we'll probably get on to the training that goes on now, so that all spray operators are, trained, up to date, competent in what they're doing, and that kind of emerging pride in the job as well, that you're really doing a good job with the tools that we've got.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a number of bodies now. We've got, like it's in a row. So, operators need to get CPD points, for instance. Voluntary initiative, which, it's been around the last 20, 30 years, and it plays its part as well, making folk aware when and where they can't spray and such like. But all these bodies round about the sector, it's making things better. One thing I think it's probably important as well, it's not just adding professionalism, it's how it looks to the public as well.
Yeah, I mean, the public care about their food, I think, and they care about how it's produced. And there's been a lot of talk about the disconnect between people and how their food is produced. But I think personally, people are more interested than they've ever been before. Um, and we see that coming through from some of our key markets and buyers and things too. So, for example, the distillers are really interested in the sustainability of what's produced. Um, so I just think that's a really healthy discussion to be having, that we're producing stuff that people want, and they should be prepared to pay for the extra benefits of that sustainable production. And that's a conversation to be had. But it's such an important area that, we're not forcing any production system onto anybody.
Yeah, yeah. And moving to more the those are recommending um, farmers, in terms of looking at crops and chemicals. Um, Basis has really come to the fore. All agronomists need to be, basis accredited, and I know it's about 12, 13 years ago, a young loon from Aberdeenshire came down to Edinburgh, SRUC, and you were one of my trainers. So there must be a lot of agronomists in Scotland that, you've helped train over the time. Most of the working agronomists, I presume, you've had a role in their training at some point.
Yeah, no, it's been a lovely way of making connections across the whole industry. I think, yes, Scotland is a kind of smaller space than the rest of the UK, so almost everybody knows everybody, which has its downsides, but is broadly positive. So yeah, the basis training, I enjoyed teaching it, but I also enjoyed doing it because I mean, I'm a pathology, a disease specialist, But that sort of having to be basis trained and to think about pests and weeds as well, I think gave me a sort of broader appreciation of the agronomist's role. And I think it can often be quite tough. I mean, the agronomist takes quite a lot of risk on in steering a client. Um, and again, I think maybe some of the IPM discussions are healthy there. What risks is the client prepared to take? Um, but yes, the temptation to perhaps over-insure for a client. I've carried that sort of feeling that you think that the risk of saying don't do something needs a careful conversation so it doesn't come back and bite you.
And of course, I have to say as well that basis wasn't just for agronomists or advisors. Um, did you see a lot of farmers doing it?
Yes, quite a lot. And I think that again is a really healthy thing that farmers can either do their own advice in a very sort of informed way, or that they can just really challenge their agronomist and have those conversations so that if you're talking about, reducing inputs or taking a new approach or tuning something up, there's a conversation on both sides there, rather than just outsourcing your agronomy decisions to somebody else.
And taking it back more to on farm, we spoke about maybe machinery and operators, but the last, well, I think it must be 25, 30 years, we've also seen farm assurance come into play, SQC, primarily in Scotland. Um, you've played a role in how that's, well, the standards that have been set and how it looks today.
Yes, I've very much enjoyed working in that food assurance space. So yeah, I'm technical director at the moment for Scottish Quality Crops. So that constant thinking about what's practical, what's relevant, what's achievable, and what can be done is just really interesting. And SQC is quite a nice example where the board is made up of different stakeholders, maltsters, millers, agronomists, farmers, the union. So there's a really good discussion there about what's possible. Initially, it was very much about the safety of the product, so making sure that it didn't have birds and light bulbs in the green heap, and we've seen that develop to um, very much the integrated approaches, the tailored nutrition, um, and the more sustainable production methods. And I dare say it will continue to develop, but there's always a kind of, I think, a really healthy discussion about what's achievable and wanted. And it's a farmer led organization, which I think is really, really key. And again, you referred to the kind of pride in the industry. I think that feeling of going, Scotland produces, some of the best crops and the highest yields in the world, and we should be really proud of that. And it's great to be able to see that assured, and to be able to, yeah, to prove that that is the case.
Um, okay, I'm looking a wee bit to the future. If you look out your crystal ball, what do you think crop protection will look like maybe in another 30 odd years?
Wow, right. I'm polishing my crystal ball now. I think it will continue to develop into really tailored. I mean, of course, there'll be a lot more automation, um, but I think it'll be much more tailored to risk. Um, at the minute we think we're clever if we tailor inputs to a field. Um, it'll be part fields, and then it will almost be down to individual plant levels. And the amount of data that will be captured there will be huge, and we'll have to deal with that. Um, I'm sure I'm probably only looking 10 or 15 years ahead here. 30 years is, will be transformative. But of course, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence. I'm sure there will be a lot that will have all this information, and there will be automated ways of it making the decisions and taking the action absolutely, there'll be little robots out there doing it. I still hope there's a space for agronomists, because I still think there's just that need to stay connected, and you know, like I've said, food and how it's produced is just, I think, too important to leave entirely to the bots.
Okay, back to present day. 2025 has seen a lot of arable farmers take a wee bit of a kicking financially. I think that'd be fair to say. Um, Prospects aren't great for the year ahead. There's people looking at other crops. Some people even thinking maybe not planting everything. There will be I suppose, a temptation to try and cut costs. Now, you want to grow your crop as cheaply as possible, but uh, what should farmers not be scrimping on?
I mean, we always have that classic saying that we manage this year's crop on last year's experience, and we all think we're wise to that, but we're probably not. What should they not scrimp on? I mean, I think it's, it would be a cliche to say tailoring the fertility, the fertilizers to the crop need, and your historic yields is just a given. Nobody's spending more there than they think they need to. But I think there's still a perception that perhaps we operate at the high end of the nitrogen input curve, and actually you can pull things back a bit there. Um, there are always ways to kind of think about your pesticide inputs and your programs, but do it in a sensible way. So the kind of, again, the one size fits all, you don't need to put T notes over everything unless you've got a demonstrated risk. There are ways to tailor um, what you need. And again, you reference some of the biostimulants. There's a lot of crop nutrition products that are going on that are quite expensive, and I think stick to the basics, or stick to the ones that are proven, and maybe, if you want to try new stuff, that's great, but really think about what it's doing. So if it's promising an elicitor effect, it's probably not going to work late in the season. And you do see stuff being used at very odd timings for what it's claiming. So I think there's nothing very smart in what I've said there, but um, probably just that constant revision, constant thinking. And I know people are nervous of not getting the inputs that they need, so you pre-buy, but insofar as you can, trying to just buy what you need and really react to what you're seeing. In an ideal world, we would be doing that.
Yeah, a year like this is where we see people. Do they put a seed dressing on? They'll maybe just be more inclined to, they could be sitting with, okay, maybe high screenings, but they might be sitting with field malt and barley. The temptation might be to sow that, save some seed costs, but perhaps just run it over a dresser. You're feeling on seed dressings?
I mean, again, per hectare, they're one of the cheapest inputs that you're going to see. But again, like any input, it should be tailored to needs. So absolutely test the seed. Um, Spring barley going into a warming soil, if you've tested it and found it net blotch, loose smut free, actually it might do okay without a seed treatment. So horses for courses. Um, I think, again, you would have to think about what your market there is. So if you're going for a high end market or for a further seed crop, obviously you wouldn't do that. But yeah, absolutely, you think about what you're doing. Um, Often a seed treatment will be the right answer, but it shouldn't be a one size fits all.
No, no. And when it comes to growing the crop, um, people look at spray bill. Some of the, agronomy charges in terms of spray bills and back to seed dressing charges, they're very visible. You get a bill. Um, what would you say to somebody who's maybe thinking of cutting their chemical rates or in the field, or looking at what the agronomist recommends and maybe just trimming it back a bit? What's the risks involved in that?
I think absolutely you should be thinking about what's the minimum you can be using. Um, there's often ways to reduce what you're doing. In the fungicides, actually, we know that lower doses are actually often, I mean, actually, they're commonly used. Hardly anybody goes in with full dose fungicides, and we know that that's helpful from a resistance point of view. Weeds and pests are a little bit different, so absolutely, you do them based on thresholds and need. Um, but there is a risk for cutting dose. So what you would be doing there is actually thinking, do I need it at all? Um, and making sure that you're alternating or mixing what's applied. Um, but yeah, nobody is in none of our interests to be using more than we need across the piece. So in the way of, like I said, just looking at what's actually happening in your crops and in surrounding crops, you know, what's the aphid status, what diseases are blowing about, um, and then only spray if you need to. That again is a win-win to me in terms of saving money, but managing the risk. And if you have to go high because the risk is high, that's okay. But you know that it was money well spent and the response is likely to be there.
Okay, will we lose actives, or perhaps actives lose their effectiveness, basically because resistance becomes a problem? Uh, Over time, as we become much more aware of how to manage this, are we becoming much better at this? Are chemicals lasting longer?
Yes and no. So kind of I've worked on fungicide resistance all my career, and there are more problems than ever. So that's not a great badge of honor. Um, but I think we're much more conscious of resistance. We try and build it in. We know that some of our new fungicides, for example, are quite high risk products. So things like the QIIs have already been classed as high risk. We only use them once in a season. We use them in mixture. We're still trying to work in a multi-site. So I think we've learned a huge amount, but resistance risks are still with us. And some of the concerns around, for example, the aphicides are very real and very present. How do we manage without something like the pyrethroids? So we have much to learn and much work still to do. But actually, the fact that now products are assessed for resistance risk before they even reach the market, they will have stuff on the label restricting, how they can be used. So that's a helpful way of prolonging their life. And then there will be that guidance area of just best practice in the agronomist and the farmer's hands. And again, trying to work diversity in there, trying to pull in those IPM tools so that we're not relying on the chemistry. That's all really positive stuff. But yeah, unfortunately, the resistance risks are still pretty pressing and probably increasing.
Yeah. Finally, Fiona, what's your 3 top tips for farmers and agronomists?
That's a really tricky question to come up with 3 pithy things. I think my first tip, George, would be perhaps not immediate to the season, but just a longer term tip. And that I think to try and be less binary in our approaches. So we put yourselves in boxes, conventional versus organic. And actually, I think that middle ground where we just think in more integrated, regenerative ways and we pull the best of both. So I think that let's be less binary in our approaches would be one tip. Um, I think bringing it down to this season, arable croppings, it's hard at the moment. So I think kind of planning your spray programs ahead. We've talked about trying to really tailor them to your need. I think that would be my thing. Plan your program ahead and really try and minimize any unnecessary expense. And I think one of the key ways to do that, my final tip, it always comes back to variety. So obviously your winter crops are in the ground, but going forward to the spring, if we can, you know, be a bit smarter at getting some of those resistant varieties in the ground as a way of minimising our risks. That would probably be my top three.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you for joining us for this episode of CropCast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe or follow. If you want to find out more about anything we've discussed on the show, or you'd like to get in touch, you can find all our details in the show notes. We look forward to seeing you again in 2026 for the next episode of CropCast. This episode was hosted by George Chalmers, produced by George Gauley, and edited by Cameron Waugh. This podcast is produced in association with the Scottish Government.
The Farm Advisory Service Podcast. Audio advice on livestock, crops and soils, environment, rural business, and more. Brought to you in association with the Scottish Government.